The sun burned white over Tunisia in May 1943, flattening the horizon into a mirage of dust and ruin. The earth shivered under distant artillery, but no Italian guns replied anymore. I walked with thousands of others, hands raised, uniforms stiff with grime, the taste of surrender bitterer than the grit in the air. Our regiment had tried to hold with Caro Armato M13/40 tanks, machines obsolete the day they rolled from the factory. Their riveted armor plates crumpled under American fire like cardboard. Even at full throttle, they barely made 30 kilometers an hour, coughing smoke while American Shermans seemed to multiply like insects across the desert ridges. We had fought bravely, or so we told ourselves, but bravery had been outnumbered. Reports spread that approximately 275,000 Axis troops were surrendering in North Africa, an entire field army disappearing in a single stroke. For me, the most crushing sight wasn't the tanks or the thunder of Allied bombers blotting the sky. It was the food. Guards handed out cigarettes, chocolate, and coffee as casually as one might pass bread at a family table. I hadn't tasted coffee in months. My family back in Naples queued for crusts, ration cards clutched like lifelines, while here the enemy tossed candy to prisoners. The columns stretched for miles, boots dragging through sand, muttered curses and prayers rising like smoke. Some men wept, some stared blankly ahead. I tried to imagine regrouping, perhaps a counterstrike in Sicily, but the thought collapsed under the weight of numbers. Italy could not replace what was lost. We had built fewer than 800 of those fragile M1340s in the entire war. America had built tanks and trucks in the tens of thousands before even stepping onto African soil. When we reached the harbor, the metallic skeletons of cranes clawed at the sky. They swung crates into the bellies of ships whose hulls dwarfed anything our Navy could muster. I felt something tighten in my chest, not just the fear of captivity, but a gnawing suspicion that what I was seeing was bigger than any battle. The war for me ended in Tunisia, yes, but its true meaning had yet to arrive. Only in America, across an ocean carried on steel I had never imagined, would I understand why Italy had never stood a chance. The harbor at Bizerte smelled of tar, diesel, and the sour sweat of men pressed together. We marched toward a towering wall of steel, the hull of a Liberty ship. Its plates gleamed under the sun, cranes groaning as they fed crates into cavernous holds. I thought it a singular marvel until I saw another behind it and another beyond that. Identical sisters waiting their turn. An American guard explained there were 2,710 of these vessels, each built in about 6 weeks. Italy's yards strained for months to launch a single freighter, and here was a fleet rolling off production lines as though stamped from a mold. We shuffled up the gangway. The deck trembled with the heartbeat of engines below. Around us rose mountains of cargo, ammunition, canned meat, barrels of fuel, towers of chocolate and cigarettes. Every crate looked larger than a month's rations for my regiment. These luxuries were not hidden in vaults, but shipped casually across an ocean at war. The Americans treated abundance as routine. Below decks, bunks stretched in endless rows, clean sheets tucked tight. In the mess, tin cups of coffee appeared in steady rhythm. I watched a guard pour sugar as if it were sand. A German prisoner sneered that such extravagance could not last. But I had seen the convoy. The horizon bristled with hulls, destroyers, and escorts, a machine of steel stretching further than my eyes could follow. If this was just one convoy, how many more churned across the Atlantic? That night, I lay awake in the vibrating dark, the engines thrum like a drumbeat of inevitability. I remembered my M13/40 tank grinding through desert dust, remembered our pilots in Machi C-202s. Brave men in planes produced only 1,000 times, struggling without fuel or spare parts. The Americans built machines by the 100,000. They built ships faster than U-boats could sink them. Each rivet in this Liberty ship whispered the same truth. We had not lost to soldiers alone. We had lost to a nation that turned industry into a weapon more devastating than any gun. As the bow cut westward into black water, I realized Italy had been defeated long before I raised my hands in Tunisia. Fog rolled low across the water as the Liberty ship crept into Boston Harbor. The salt air carried something sharper than the Mediterranean, coal smoke and the metallic tang of machinery. When the gangway slammed against the dock, I expected silence, perhaps the hush of a city at war. Instead, I heard the roar of cranes grinding, winches clattering, and truck engines coughing to life. The dockside looked less like a port and more like a factory floor that stretched to the horizon. We were herded down the plank, boots clattering on steel. Before me, lined in neat rows like toys in a giant's playroom, stood GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, the Americans' famous deuce and a halves. Their hoods gleamed with fresh paint, tires still stenciled with factory chalk. There were dozens on this pier alone, perhaps hundreds, and a guard casually mentioned that more than 500,000 had been built. I nearly laughed. Italy struggled to keep a handful of battered lorries running with scavenged parts, while here trucks seemed to multiply like rabbits. The cargo followed the same pattern. A crate marked beer export slammed onto a flatbed beside one marked munitions. Another bore the Coca-Cola script, and a dock worker laughed as he balanced on the stack. To us, such luxuries had become memories. To them, they were freight no different than bullets. That irony hit harder than any blow. An American stevedore shouted to his mate that a trainload was delayed upriver. I looked past the cranes to the yard beyond, where lines of rail cars stretched into haze. Each boxcar seemed stuffed with food, fuel, or weapons. The entire city pulsed with rhythm, like a heart driving blood through arteries of steel and wood. Boston was not merely receiving us, it was dispatching armies outward, endlessly. As we marched toward the waiting trucks, the German beside me muttered that America was decadent, soft. He said a nation drowning in candy and beer could not fight for long. Yet I saw how casually these men lifted crates heavier than anything I'd carried in service, how precisely the operation moved. Crane to truck, truck to rail, rail to depot. This was discipline of a different kind, industrial discipline. That night in the holding barracks, the smell of coal smoke still in my clothes, I tried to picture Italy's future. The ports of Naples, the yards of Genoa, they were ashes compared to this. The Germans promised us their science would win the war, their tanks and rockets turning tides. But science alone could not conjure 500,000 trucks or 1,000 ships. As I closed my eyes, I understood. I had stepped into a land where production itself was a weapon, and the war had already tilted beyond recovery. The train clattered across endless plains, windows filled with nothing but sky and dust. When the guards finally ordered us off, I tasted the air of Texas, dry, sharp, and relentless. Ahead stretched barbed wire, guard towers, and rows of barracks that would become our new world, Camp Hereford, a prison for thousands like me. The first shock was not the wire or the watchtowers, but the canteen. Inside, shelves groaned with cigarettes, candy bars, and bottles of beer. We were issued camp scrip, 80 cents a day, currency that bought luxuries my family in Naples had not seen in years. One man bought a chocolate bar and cried quietly as he unwrapped it. Another tucked away cigarettes to mail home with letters permitted by the Americans. In those letters, men wrote words like, "This is what I'm eating. You need to go to the Americans." The guards knew these lines would travel back across the Atlantic, eroding resistance more efficiently than leaflets dropped from planes. Life in camp settled into routines both humiliating and strangely human. We played soccer on dusty fields, boots kicking up clouds under the endless sun. A group of artists painted murals in the camp chapel, brushes dipped into colors provided by local parishes. On Sundays, choirs of prisoners and Texans sometimes sang together, voices mingling above the wire. Yet always the contrasts cut deep. At the front, my comrades rationed bullets and bread. Here, prisoners sipped beer after a match, or debated who would star in the camp musical. The Americans had stripped us of freedom, but given us a glimpse of plenty. It was a generosity born not of charity, but of surplus. They could afford to treat prisoners well, because they had more of everything than we had ever dreamed possible. Even the dust storms seemed to underline abundance. When the panhandle winds roared, the horizon vanished in red haze, and still the kitchens fed us without pause. Grain elevators rose outside the wire, concrete towers pouring wheat for markets overseas. Local farmers, short on labor, soon petitioned for POW work details. We harvested carrots, picked potatoes, and saw firsthand how, even in wartime, America's fields produced more than entire nations could consume. At night, under the glare of floodlights, I listened to the wind scratch against the barracks and wondered how long Italy could continue the charade of resistance. If prisoners in the desert of Texas lived better than soldiers at the front, what did that say about the future of the war? I had not yet worn an American uniform, but already the truth whispered in every meal, every paycheck and camp script, every candy wrapper tossed into the dust. We had lost before the fighting even reached our homeland. The letter of surrender reached us months after we already knew the truth. On the 8th of September 1943, Italy signed the armistice. In Texas, the news was met with a ripple of disbelief, then a kind of weary relief. For many of us, the endless war had ended in the desert. Now, suddenly, there was a path forward: the Italian service units. Men who pledged loyalty to the new government could step out of the wire and into a different kind of uniform. I hesitated only briefly. Remaining a hardliner meant isolation, confinement with the bitter few who still believed in Mussolini. I had seen enough to know that road was hopeless. When they issued me a khaki uniform, the stitching caught my eye. On the shoulder, in block letters, one word: Italy. Not enemy, not traitor, simply Italy. I pulled it on and felt both shame and relief. We were still prisoners, but now we would work. Our pay was $24 a month, 1/3 in cash, the rest in camp scrip. To men who had watched their families scrape for bread, it was astonishing. My unit boarded trains east, the rattling cars carrying us away from the dust storms of Texas to the damp, salt air of New England. The destination, the Boston port of embarkation. There, we would become stevedores, laborers, and mechanics, helping to move the tide of supplies that pulsed through the city day and night. At first, it felt humiliating to handle the crates of the very army that had captured me. But quickly, another realization crept in. By touching this machinery of war, I could measure its scale with my own hands. The docks rang with the clang of chains, the growl of engines, the constant shriek of gulls. Crates marked ordnance stood beside barrels stamped beer. Pallets of canned meat clattered onto rail cars. Even chocolate appeared in bulk, stacked in boxes taller than a man. We were prisoners turned laborers, but we were also witnesses. Every day we moved the equivalent of a regiment's sustenance, and every day the flow never slowed. One evening, after hours of hauling crates, I leaned on a pier piling and watched the lights of the harbor burn against the night. Ships steamed out into the Atlantic heavy with cargo, while others slid in to be filled again. My sweat cooled in the sea breeze, and I thought of my brother in Naples, likely chewing stale bread, while here I touched crates bursting with candy. The irony cut deep. The Americans were not starving us into submission. They were drowning us in proof that their world could never be matched. The first time I lifted a crate stamped Coca-Cola, I thought it a mistake. Surely glass bottles were too fragile, too unnecessary for wartime shipping. Yet there they were, hundreds of cases, bound for soldiers overseas. A day later, another load came marked simply beer. When I asked a dock supervisor about it, he laughed and said, "The boys need something to drink." His tone carried no irony, no awareness of absurdity. In his world, crates of soda and beer were freight as ordinary as bullets. That revelation struck harder than the rifles of Tunisia. Italy rationed bread by the ounce. Our tanks ran short of shells. Our aircraft sat idle for lack of fuel. Yet here the enemy shipped luxuries across an ocean at war, confident they had more than enough steel, glass, and ships to spare. The impossible statistic lived in my hands. America produced so much that even its waste exceeded Italy's total capacity. Beside me, a German prisoner cursed under his breath. He still believed in the Reich, muttering that these soft Americans would crumble under real sacrifice. I watched as another convoy of Liberty ships slid into harbor, cranes feeding their bellies with everything from rations to rifles. I thought of his words and knew he was wrong. This wasn't softness. This was strength measured in surplus. Each shift blurred into another. We hoisted crates of ammunition, dragged barrels of fuel, stacked pallets of food. The rhythm was endless. Ship, crane, truck, rail, repeat. At night, I lay on my bunk with muscles aching, the smell of tar and salt still in my nostrils. Yet what stayed with me most was not the exhaustion, but the realization. There was no bottom to this well. Italy's factories had produced fewer than 1,100 Machi C-202 fighters in the entire war. America built more aircraft in a single month than my homeland had built in years. On Sundays, some of us were allowed passes into the city. Families welcomed us to church suppers, where tables sagged with food. Children laughed as we kicked soccer balls in parish yards. The generosity of strangers reinforced what the docs had already taught me. Abundance was not the exception here. It was the rule. One evening, as I wiped sweat from my brow and watched a trainload of trucks rumble west, I realized I had seen the true engine of victory. Not strategy, not genius, not even bravery alone, but production. The Americans had turned industry into a weapon so vast, so relentless, that it made resistance a fantasy. Every crate of soda, every bottle of beer, was proof that Italy had never stood a chance. The news reached us in camp before the dust of Texas had fully left my boots. In July 1943, while we shoveled crates in Boston, the Americans and British stormed Sicily. Some men learned from newspapers passed by guards, others from whispered radio reports. For me, the memory came sharper. I had fought in those olive groves months before, watching Italian armor disintegrate under Allied fire. Now Sicily fell in 38 days, a campaign carried on the back of ships and aircraft that seemed to appear without end. I remembered the Regio Esercito's 6th Army, commanded by General Alfredo Guzzoni, and its collapse. Reports told of over 116,000 Italian troops captured or missing, alongside thousands killed or wounded. American losses were a fraction by comparison, less than 9,000. The disparity told the story better than any propaganda. Our divisions had been ground down not just by bullets, but by logistics. They could not resist the tide of steel landing daily on Sicilian beaches. In camp, American guards sometimes screened films for us, newsreels of the invasion. I sat on a wooden bench and watched the flickering black and white images of LSTS, landing ship, tanks, lowering ramps, and disgorging Shermans onto the shore. The sight turned my stomach. The Italians had built fewer than 1,000 tanks across the entire war. America unloaded more armored vehicles in a single operation than Italy could hope to field in a year. The memory of my M13/40 came back to me with shame. 32 kilometers an hour on a good road, 30 millimeters of armor, a 47 millimeter gun that could barely dent a Sherman's hide. We had driven them bravely, but they were coffins on tracks. Watching the newsreel, I realized the Americans had planned every landing with machines like my tank already factored as obsolete. After the film ended, a German POW muttered that Sicily was only lost because Italy had betrayed itself. But I had seen enough. The betrayal was not of will, but of industry. No courage could multiply tanks. No speech from Mussolini could conjure ships. That night I lay awake in the barracks. I remembered the white dust of Sicilian roads, the smell of olives crushed under tank treads, the hopelessness in men's eyes as supply lines collapsed. and now I knew the scale of what faced us. More than 3,000 Allied ships had carried the invasion across the Mediterranean. America could repeat the miracle at will. Sicily had not been the end of the war. It had been rehearsal. The realization deepened with each passing month. In the docks of Boston, I handled crates by the ton, but one day a camp chaplain left a newspaper on the mess table, and the statistics struck me harder than any physical labor. In 1944 alone, America produced 96,000 aircraft. I read the number again and again. My homeland had built barely 11,000 in the entire war. What Italy produced across years, America exceeded in 6 weeks. The figures cascaded like artillery. 310,000 aircraft total by war's end, 2.4 million trucks, 124,000 ships. I remembered struggling to keep a single lorry running in Tunisia with scavenged German parts, while Detroit rolled out convoys as easily as bread from an oven. In the rail yard near the harbor, I saw those statistics alive. Trains thundered past the camp fence, flat cars stacked with Shermans, boxcars filled with ammunition. Their rhythm seemed endless, the ground shaking as if industry itself had become a weapon of war. Men joked that even the Americans' scrap heaps were larger than our arsenals. It did not feel like a joke to me. The chaplain, a kindly man who spoke Italian haltingly, sat with us one evening. "You see," he said, tapping the newspaper, "it is not just soldiers who fight. It is factories, farms, shipyards. Here, everyone is part of the war." I thought of my father, a tailor in Naples, sewing shirts while Allied bombers shook the city. Italy had no arsenal to match this. Democracy had turned its citizens into an army of workers. The impossible statistic haunted me. One American factory, Willow Run in Michigan, built one B-24 bomber every hour. Each day, that line of bombers outproduced Italy's entire annual capacity for fighters. How could men in fragile Machi C-202s, only 1,000 built in total, ever contest skies filled with endless liberators? That night, lying on my bunk, I listened to the engines of a train in the distance and realized I was hearing the pulse of a nation at war. The clatter of steel wheels was not just noise, it was victory measured in rivets and bolts. Italy had entered the war with soldiers full of courage and tanks full of promises, but courage cannot fill an empty warehouse. America had filled every warehouse, every yard, every port. As the train whistle faded, I knew the true battlefield was not in Tunisia or Sicily. It was in Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, cities that forged steel into freedom. The censors read every line we wrote, yet the Americans knew exactly what to let through. They wanted our words to travel across the ocean, and they did. At Camp Hereford and later in Boston, we were given paper, pencils, and instructions to keep letters short. Men wrote dutifully, reassurances to mothers, greetings to wives, but woven between the lines was something far more powerful than propaganda. "This is what I'm eating," one man wrote home. "You need to go to the Americans." It was not boasting, it was shock. We had been fed meat, vegetables, even sweets. We had earned wages, 80 cents a day in camp scrip, and bought beer or chocolate at the canteen. We played soccer matches under the Texan sun. I myself wrote to my brother in Naples, describing food stacked higher than a man's head and stores that never ran dry. I hesitated as I wrote, sensing the censors would allow these lines to pass. Perhaps that was the point. The Germans in our camp mocked us. They said the Reich would outlast American decadence. They said letters like ours were betrayal. But betrayal of what? Hunger? Futility? Italy's heart had been breaking long before I put pen to paper. My words simply carried the truth across the Atlantic. That prisoners lived better than soldiers, that America's abundance made resistance absurd. The Americans understood this better than we did. They allowed the flow of mail, knowing each sheet of paper was a weapon sharper than any bayonet. Stories of POW meals, POW wages, POW movies. These reached homes still rationing crusts of bread. My mother's reply arrived months later, trembling ink across thin paper. If you are safe, then perhaps this war can end. I heard rumors that intercepted letters had circulated among Italian soldiers at the front. Some units surrendered without a fight, convinced captivity meant survival. If true, then the pen and the ration card had broken more divisions than artillery ever could. One evening, after finishing a shift at the docks, I watched men around me seal envelopes. They licked stamps, folded paper, and placed them carefully in the box. I thought then that we were no longer simply prisoners. We were messengers, carrying proof of defeat back to our own country. And the irony was unbearable. We had been captured, yet it was our voices, encouraged, even amplified by our captors, that helped dismantle the regime we once fought to defend. The night was heavy with the smell of coal smoke and sea salt when I finally saw it clearly. I stood on the edge of Boston's docks after a long shift, sweat cooling under the harbor wind, and watched a freight train roll past. Flat cars clanked by one after another, each stacked with GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, headlights glinting under arc lamps. The line of them stretched so far I could not see its end. The rhythm of steel wheels on tracks seemed endless, as if the earth itself were pulsing with industry. I thought of my first tank, the M1340, groaning across Sicilian roads at 30 kilometers an hour, its armor thinner than a Sherman side plate. Italy had built fewer than 800 of those tanks in the entire war. America had built more than 500,000 of these trucks, and they rolled out of factories by the thousands every month. In that moment, standing with tar dust on my boots, I understood fully. The war was not being won on the battlefield. It had already been won in Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. A German POW beside me muttered that America's softness would undo them. I didn't answer. I remembered the convoy across the Atlantic, ships stretching beyond the horizon. I remembered newsreels of Sicily, with 3,000 Allied ships landing men and machines. I remembered the impossible statistic of 96,000 American aircraft built in 1944 alone. None of this was softness. This was strength unlike anything the world had ever seen. The trucks rattled past for what felt like an eternity. Their engines gleamed under the lights, fresh from the assembly line, waiting to be shipped overseas. Each one represented more than horsepower. Each was proof of a nation's will to flood battlefields with abundance until no enemy could stand. My country had sent boys into battle with rifles older than their fathers, rationed shells, and hope as thin as paper. Against this, what hope could there be? As the last car rattled into the night, I felt a hollow certainty settle inside me. Italy had never stood a chance. We had not lost in the desert, or in Sicily, or on the mainland. We had lost the moment America's factories roared to life, the moment democracy turned its workers into warriors without uniforms. The realization was both crushing and strangely liberating. For the first time, I knew the truth with absolute clarity. The war was over, even if the world had not yet admitted it. The further the war advanced, the clearer it became that even our captivity had become part of America's arsenal. At first, I thought our labor was little more than charity work, a way to keep idle hands busy. But when orders came, we were moved into fields, factories, and depots. In Texas, I bent over rows of carrots, hands sunk in the black earth while the wind scoured my back with dust. In Massachusetts, I rolled barrels onto trucks or stacked crates of ammunition until my arms shook. The numbers astonished me. We were told later that Italian service units contributed more than 90 million man-days of labor, worth $230 million in wages and productivity. It freed American soldiers for combat, let them carry rifles instead of shovels. I realized with a strange pang that even as a prisoner, I had become a cog in the machine that was dismantling my homeland's war effort. I saw it most clearly during harvest. Local farmers drove us out in trucks, their wives waiting with baskets of sandwiches and jugs of cold water. We bent under the sun, pulling potatoes and stacking sacks until wagons overflowed. In Italy, the harvest was shrinking under bombing and requisitions. Here, even in wartime, the land yielded more than men could eat. The farmers laughed, insisting their fields fed not just America, but soldiers across oceans. The paradox cut deep. We were prisoners, yet we ate better than our families. We worked, yet we were paid. We wore American uniforms, yet stitched with the word Italy. I often wondered how history would record us, traitors, collaborators, or simply men who had no other choice. What I could not deny was the efficiency. Trains rumbled west with the produce we harvested, east with the ammunition we stacked. Ships carried it to Europe, where other Italians fought and surrendered. The circle was complete. America had found a way to turn even its enemies into force multipliers. One evening, standing by a grain elevator taller than any church in Naples, I watched concrete pour into molds, shaping silos that would hold wheat for millions. Dust rose, choking and sweet. It struck me then that abundance itself had become a weapon. Italy could not starve America into surrender. America could feed itself, its armies, and even its prisoners without pause. As the elevator loomed above me, floodlights glaring against the night, I realized this was more than victory. It was inevitability. Our labor, our letters, even our surrender had become threads in the same web. And once woven, that web would catch the entire Axis in its steel grip. By 1945, whispers of Germany's collapse filled the camp. Radios crackled with news of Allied advances, of cities falling one by one. When word came that Mussolini had been killed and Berlin had surrendered, I felt no triumph, only exhaustion. My uniform still bore the patch with Italy on the sleeve, but by then it felt more like a relic than a nationality. I began to measure the war not in battles, but in numbers. America had produced 355,000 aircraft, 2.4 million trucks, 124,000 ships. Italy had produced 11,000 planes across the whole war, fewer than America built in 2 months of 1944. One factory in Michigan, Willow Run, had turned out a bomber every hour, day and night. I thought of that line of aircraft stretching into the sky, an assembly line of thunder, and knew no nation could stand against such a tide. The reckoning was not only statistical, it was human. I thought of the Americans I had met, the farmer's wife handing me bread, the chaplain translating scripture, the dock worker laughing as he stacked beer beside bullets. They fought not only with machines, but with generosity. They could treat prisoners with decency because they had more than enough. Their abundance was not decadence. It was power born of democracy, of free men working not out of fear, but out of conviction. As the day of repatriation approached, I packed the few belongings I had: a worn cap, letters from home, and a scrap of paper with numbers I could not forget. 96,000 aircraft in 1944, 500,000 trucks, 1 Liberty ship every 42 days. These figures were not just statistics, they were verdicts. Each represented the futility of resistance, the certainty of defeat, the overwhelming weight of an industrial democracy turned to war. On the train east, bound for the ships that would carry us back to Europe, I watched the American landscape blur past. Fields stretched unbroken to the horizon. Factories smoked in the distance, still humming, though the war was over. I realized then that I had come to America a prisoner, but was leaving as a witness. I had seen the true engine of victory, and it was not in the rifle or the tank. It was in the marriage of freedom and industry, a union that no dictator could equal. When the harbor came into view, cranes still swung against the sky. I thought back to the first time I had seen them, stepping off a Liberty ship, stunned by abundance. Now, 2 years later, I knew the truth. Italy had never stood a chance, not against men who could forge democracy into steel, food, and ships until tyranny itself drowned under the weight.